Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Culture that appeals to no one, is patronized by no one, and provides meaning to no one, ceases to be art, is merely a burden for people to carry. We say, let the value of art be decided by the people, insofar as art that has meaning to no one lacks meaning at all. All right, a 4-point model before I go into my 2 points of how today. Firstly, we think that the level of funding of the art is likely going to be same on both sides. It's just the form that this art probably takes, or like the form of government assistance that takes place on both sides is just different. So we think that the level of direct state funding that currently exists, we're probably going to like provide an equal amount of funding on our side just in the form of these vouchers. Secondly, we think you're probably going to be able to spend on this art, on any art of your choosing on our side. I'll be further elaborating on that later. And thirdly, if you don't use the vouchers, very simply the government will not pay out. So the price of these vouchers and like the government investment in these vouchers only takes place insofar as you actually use them. And fourthly, if you see certain arts as like particularly deserving of protection, if the government sees certain arts as particularly deserving of protection, so for instance, think about minority arts, and let's say if the government really does want to take care of this art and make sure that the minority art will be taken care of, and they uniquely see that you require government intervention, we think the government can still prod the art to be patronized in that certain direction. So for instance, if it's minority art, you can just give more vouchers to these minorities to use. We think that's perfectly within our fiat to argue. All right, 2 points for the house today. Firstly, about more efficient spending on art, and secondly, about the variety of art. Firstly, more efficient spending on art. Let's really quickly look at what exactly is the problem with government direct spending. Well, recognize that it tends to be very unilateral and that tends to be incredibly bad. Why is it that oftentimes the government has a disproportionate amount of say in what kind of art gets funded? Well, I think it tends to be incredibly unrepresentative of what the people want for the simple reason that surveys are incredibly inefficient, censuses are incredibly inefficient. You're going to need to survey an incredibly large amount of people, and this is just incredibly draining on resources. So then the decision tends to fall then to the people in the government, to people like in, let's say, the culture ministries and whatever not. Why does this tend to be bad? 3 reasons. Because obviously the people in the government just lack epistemic access to everyone's thoughts. It's really difficult for the government to really accurately represent everyone's thoughts, particularly in places with a very high level of cultural diversity. Secondly, think about who actually tend to be ministers in the very first place, who tend to join the government in the very first place. They tend to be people who are incredibly privileged. They tend to be people who oftentimes are very educated, and that's the reason why they're even able to access politics in the very first place. Given that they tend to come from a certain background, and in cases where there's a lot of cultural diversity, they also tend to come from, let's say, the more privileged minority groups. The more privileged majority groups. In such cases, we think that obviously they're going to have a very one specific background. They're going to have one very specific conception about what kind of art should be valued. We think this may not be representative of everyone in the government, of everyone in the nation. And thirdly, this tends to be especially reinforced by a bureaucratic echo chamber. Think about how oftentimes, as we mentioned, because everyone tends to be of the same background, they oftentimes tend to have this echo chamber where everyone just agrees with each other. This is particularly because bureaucratic processes are very long, are very draining. And so oftentimes, this also tends to be an incredibly slow process. And let's say in the processes, when the government does screw up, and let's say they do have a bad choice about what exactly is the good prioritization of art, why is it likely that they are unlikely to be able to remedy this and they're unable to recover? I think firstly, just think about what governments are like. Governments depend very heavily on their image. They depend on that in order for them to get elected in the next electoral cycle. So they probably don't want to admit fault. They probably don't want to actually publicly admit that they did something wrong, just so that people will hopefully ignore it in the next electoral cycle. But secondly, even if they do find out and they probably do want to reallocate funding, think about it. It's money that's already been lost. In backtracking, it's an inherently retrospective action. You probably need to see that in order for you to realize that you screwed up, money has already been lost in the process. And this is something that we think is incredibly bad, incredibly inefficient. So what does this result in? We think it results in bad allocation of funds in terms of you allocating to forms of art that tend not to be very popular or people tend not to resonate with. Why is this bad? Because 3 reasons. Because firstly, money is incredibly limited in the very first place. So oftentimes it's incredibly important that you actually cater to the pieces of culture that people like. Secondly, this is government funding that's via taxation. You take this money, this is people's money that you take from them via literal coercion, via literal violence. Insofar as that, we think that you at the very least, as the government, have the duty to manage this money well. If you don't represent the people, then you're effectively wasting people's money. Thirdly, if the people don't like this art and they feel like you're not actually spending on things that people like, I think they're incredibly likely to be very very angry. And so this results in a lower willingness to fund art in general, insofar as they feel that the government is not going to do it well. All right, how does our side better this? We think we just let the market decide is the most direct mechanism. It like cuts through all of that bureaucratic nonsense that I previously mentioned. And this is incredibly important because art is subjective. What at one point may be deemed to be important art may not always be deemed to be important. So oftentimes, as the market shifts, the people's consumption can move to that. But secondly, this also results in greater happiness insofar as people directly feel more in control of what they're consuming. But before I go on, sure, I'll take a POI.
So are you transferring all state funding, direct funding to art to vouchers?
We're fine with that. Anyway, second point, variety of art. We think, okay, recognize that insofar as the government cannot fund every single piece of art, we are more likely to going to present like a preset variety of art. But why is this but we think that on our side, at the very least, we have more variety, or at the very least, it's more dependent on what the market wants. I think this is an incredibly intuitive claim. Why is this important? Because art is subjective. What people like is subjective. Insofar as insofar as they want to actually materialize any of the benefits of patronizing art. So think about all the things that you mentioned about personal enrichment, about enjoyment of the arts, and how this is a very personal process. I think people find a lot more meaning in it when they can actually take a look and patronize all the different options and then decide what they like. And so we think that in terms of your personal development, this is incredibly important to you. And we should then prioritize choice and give the people the choice based in order to best empower them, in order to best empower this personal enjoyment. But secondly, this also is important because the government may not necessarily be a good actor. They oftentimes have a lot of incentives to like shut out certain fields of art. This looks like, for example, in a very patriarchal society or in a very homophobic society, like shutting out of queer or feminist art. But secondly, it also looks like the government being very politically motivated. You're obviously not going to feel oppositional art. So, for example, the Vietnam War, you're probably not going to feel Picasso's Guernica. So, with direct funding, it's just very easy to discriminate against this. Like several reasons, like you can very easily give, like, oh, we have limited money, this is not a very big priority, or this is very unpopular. But with the culture voucher, it's much harder to claim all of these because you're not the difference between not funding versus directly blocking people who want to watch it is incredibly big. You can no longer utilize ideas of this art no longer being popular. It's also a lot more overt, it's a lot more obvious, and a lot more likely to attract backlash, not only from your own people who want to watch that art, but also international governments who see you as cracking down on democracy. So why is this incredibly important? We think it's just far more likely that this art is going to be fielded on our side, allowing for people like of minority groups to feel represented, but also allowing for the people from the majority to actually get more exposure to this art, to actually be like know about the experiences of minorities or know about the people who are in the political opposition. Insofar as that creates greater discourse, greater representation, we are so proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Leader Wong.
Hi. Let me just set up a camera. If you like your voice, I want to take a chat.
Leader Wop, I don't know if it's just me, but I think your voice is really faint. Maybe
Yes.
reposition your microphone, adjust settings, or I don't know, just speak louder.
Okay, let me just. Oh, yeah, I'll just position the phone near to my face.
Yeah, it's loads better now.
Okay, is this better? Like, am I clear? Okay, I'm gonna assume I'm clear. I'll just speak louder as well for that turn. But if I become unheard, just cut me off. It's okay. But yeah, pure your voice because I will be taking that. 3, 2, 1. Art is a reflection of our collective experiences and our own individuality. What government tries to do is morally abhorrent because they want to shift to a model that takes away the power from these specific artists and puts them in the power of rich people and the elites to dictate what types of art we should consume. Two direct responses, and then the rest is integrated to my argumentation. Firstly, they try to tell you that in government side, they have the fiat to protect all types of art. And when questioned, they just say, oh, this is government fiat. Why is this untrue? Because understand that the protection dictates things like security, equipment, having enough personnel to ensure that nobody tampers with these very expensive paintings or sculptures. You need places to store them, like in museums or storage houses, which, surprise, surprise, need a lot of money and direct government intervention, whether it be through lending guards, lending trucks, and lending areas where they can store them safely. So they can't just have fiat to say we can still protect art in their side of the house. They have to take that trade-off. But secondly, they have this misconception on the nature of art in general, when a lot of their illustrations and analysis is focused on things like paintings and how it's a lot of useless art that people don't really care about. This is untrue. Notice the lack of nuance and contextualization in their illustrations. Understand that the nature of art right now is very wide. Art can vary from the past historical art to sculptures and paintings from members of the past who are meant to represent the rich history of specific nations. Like how in the Philippines, we have Spolarium, which is the largest painting in history, which is painted from our national heroes as a response to Spanish oppression. But you also have things like pre-colonial literature or colonial literature that talks about the struggles of our ancestors. You have things like pre-colonial texts, art pieces, and fashion that is meant to represent the unique cultural heritage of the endangered indigenous populations in many specific nations. Understand that art in it of itself is so varied and wide that has spanned centuries and multiple centuries, which means that their monolithic view is simply flawed. Understand that the clash is very simple in this debate. In government, they try to prioritize the specific demand of art and trying to use mechanisms like the market to weed out what's considered bad art. While in opposition, our stance is very simple. We prefer the model of direct investment because it secures the supply of not just creating new art, but preserving the old important art from the past and the present. But before the rest of my argumentation, go POI.
You can glamorize this type of art all you want, but if no one is interested in pre-colonial texts anymore, why continue funding the new production of it?
That is literally the excuse that the Americans made when they killed the Indians. That's not just because people don't care about it doesn't just because people in the cities and the majority population don't care about it doesn't mean that the members of that tribe, of that community out in the mountains don't care about it. You are sacrificing their own individuality and their own experiences for the sake of the majoritarian people who live in the big cities. Shame on that. First argumentation then that it's significantly worse in their side of the house because there's less art that's going to be created, which is the prerequisite for any forms of benefit. Understand that the creation of art in it of itself is very costly and expensive. To create a play, to create a show, even to create a painting requires hours, if not hundreds of hours of dedicated time and effort to conceptualize what specific art pieces you're going to make. It also requires a lot of time and effort, for example, when you're making plays or other forms of art like that, you require a lot of personnel. You also require a lot of time to translate past specific types of art, which often requires state subsidies because they are a constant source of money for both the personnel and people who are professionals who are required to ensure that this is done well, but also the specific types of equipment to ensure you're doing it at the most sustainable pace, which also gives an opportunity for individuals who are passionate about specific portions of art, and maybe it's because it's part of their own cultural heritage, or it's part of their own community as a whole. The implications on government are this: that in their side of the house, when you rely on when you remove the constant source of public investment or state investment, you then rely on private investors who have worse off incentives because they are probably going to be focused on using the specific art that they fund to be more privately used, and they probably want to use it for specific clout or corporate use for their own individual corporations. When you get mass privatization on their side of the house, they inherently have to increase the price of these specific the art types they are creating, even if in the best case they open it to the public. There's a higher barrier of entry to access to specific art in the first place. Why is this bad? And this is a direct response to the market mechanism that they try to do. Two reasons as to why the market can't regulate good art. Firstly, understand that the interest of the market in it of itself is often skewed to the majoritarian. So they're going to focus on the people in the city who only care about Broadway plays or things like that have high Western influence. They're going to forget about the indigenous peoples, the people in the mountains, who have their own centuries rich of cultural tradition. But number two, understand that these specific types of interests are focused on the present and often skewed by things like social media, wherein the capacity for people to appreciate the specific historical cultural heritage is becoming less and less by the day. Therefore, if their mechanism is to try to say that the market will solve it, understand that the market is inherently flawed because the capacity for people is unfair for those who aren't part of the majority. Understand that this is significantly worse on their side for two weighing metrics. Number one, that there are no alternatives for these artists at the end of the day. That when art is decent, it's harder to shift to any sort of other sources of income. But secondly, it's also more certain that the harm's gonna happen in their side house because the overall trend that right now society is shifting towards a STEM-focused type of logic or type of mindset wherein people don't care as much about it, which means in their side of the house, not only do they have to rely on a population that only cares about the modern types of art that aren't representative of the past, they also have to rely on a population that is generally not caring about art anymore. Second argumentation then why art is becoming less diverse and significantly worse on their side when they're beholden to private investors. Because even if you try to engage on their best case, that okay, let's assume that there is still some funding, but why is it bad that it goes from these private investors? Understand because the inherent power symmetry is going to be created. There are two problems with this. Number one, when the direct funding goes to these rich investors who are part of the 1% 1%, the context of this specific art in and of itself is going to be catered to their needs. Understand that rich people care more about highbrow and abstract art because of their wealthy lifestyle, and that's something that stimulates them. And things like more minority-focused arts to talk about the BLM movement or social struggles are going to be looked out or looked over because this is not in the interest of these rich people when they themselves are the ones targeted by these specific types of targeted art. The implications then are very simple. And there's, at least in our side of the house, when you have state-sponsored interests, understand that the state doesn't really care about the type of art. They're gonna blanketly give you investments as long as you are giving back to it in terms of the heritage. Which is really quickly on the third point on why direct funding is the better comparative. Understand because the broader reach of the state is significantly better. Because we have to understand how exactly does the state fund art in the first place. They probably do this through things like institutions or local government units who are the ones who proliferate the specific funding to local communities and local artists in order. Because there are three reasons the state cares about art. Number one, for nation building and nationalism. Number two, for external economic factors like tourism. And number three, for cultural and state preservation. Understand that the state are the exclusive actor to have these specific interests in mind because number one, they care about the past, they care about nation building because that is what gives them legitimacy to be a state in the first place. But secondly, they also care about the economic benefits of state funding, such as tourism, how a lot of developed states, for example, like France and Germany, where in the motion is set and the info side is set, rely on art tourism as a main source of income. Do not get this in their side of the house with private investors because they only care about their own individual circles, their own individual experiences. So at least the state is comparatively the better actor. So that's not doable. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hello. Just reminder, if you do exceed 7:15, please stop taking notes. Probably best to wrap up by then, but like even if you go over, just heads up, we stop taking notes. And when I say we, I just mean me since it's just me judging. But yeah, DPM, you have the floor.
Hi, give me a quick second to just quickly organize my notes. I'll take POIs verbally, by the way. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opposition began on the back foot when they opened with a gross misrepresentation of our case. Because what Ashley gave to you in her speech was not the idea that we should protect all forms of art, but that the most efficient form of spending of government funds into arts is what should take priority in this debate. And we cannot on both sides agree that all particular forms of art will be able to be protected. So opposition is correct in that there needs to be a trade-off. But this opposition is the ones that seem unwilling to take the trade-off of what kinds of art do they want to protect. With their entire idealistic message of all types of arts are all forms of art should be protected. All forms of art should be good. There is no tangible or feasible way for them to actually achieve the outcome they wanted at the end of the day. I want to begin this speech with a strategic response before I move on to the rest of my substantives, because opposition imposes a very major burden upon themselves when they told you that we don't have the fiat to fund all forms of art. Everything they've told you thus far in their case has been extremely negative. They told you we must take a trade-off between certain forms of art that we fund. They told us we cannot protect all forms of art. And that's largely true. But if it's true that we need to take a trade-off on what forms of art to protect, then they need to take a trade-off on what types of art should they prioritize as well. And so not a single part of the leader of opposition describes to us a single bit of what they consider to be good art or art that the state should be funding into. They give you ideals, things for example like the BLM movement, things for example like left-wing, like art. But is all of the funding going to go into left-wing art and you're going to completely shut out the voices of the right? There is no particular ability for you to guarantee freedom of expression or the vast majority of artists on your side as well. That means thus far, they have to wait till DLO before they give us an actually proper counterprop. And that means that they're on a strategic back foot in this debate. This is the trade-off that we took for the very beginning of PM. We told you this debate is about where we allocate resources. That it's not just a debate about ideals on where we should be funding art, but when it comes to the government with limited amounts of funding and very finite resources, where should we best allocate the art? We are fine if art that people don't care about dies off. We are fine if certain forms of cultural art dies off if nobody wants to help supplement them anymore. But what we're not fine with is spending millions, hundreds of thousands of dollars into certain forms of art only for nobody to give you the returns that you should have gotten under your responsibility of the government. This is a debate about spending. You cannot just talk about your virtue signaling of art if you're unable to engage with the practicals of this debate. This leads on to the first question I want to ask in this debate. What is the inherent value of culture? I want to note the incredible logical lead that looms over the entire opposition case thus far, because they spend 3 out of 7 whole minutes glamorizing all different forms of art and talking about how certain pre-colonial arts are extremely important for identity and individuality for tons of different people in this debate. But if those tons of different people in this debate were to care about the individuality of this art, and if they were to really care about the impact that this art has on their identity, those people will use the vouchers to still fund those forms of art on our side regardless. So it's unclear as to why people that still care about the art are unable to donate towards that kind of art, or continue funding the art, that type of art, through things like engaging with that genre of art. If people truly cared so much, I don't think these types of art are gonna die out. In fact, if people cared so much, that's all the more reason as to why the vouchers we give to the people to decide what kind of art they truly care about will be able to be sustained as a result of their own engagement. But their feeble response to my POI was, just because people don't care about it doesn't mean it isn't worth keeping. But their own reasons for why it is worth keeping are predicated on people caring about them. Their own reasons for saying that this art is good because of identity is predicated on people still resonating with the identification that these art puts onto them. So insofar as no one else is able to resonate with this identity, insofar as no one else feels that sort of resonating with that kind of art, I don't know what kind of individuality you can fight for if nobody is going to resonate with that individuality anymore. There is no worth to funding this kind of art. Culture inherently dies out regardless on your side. And that is important, because I think the important outcome is what we have to note on what happens after they fund all of this. Once they pull your hundreds of thousands of funding into this art that's going to die out in the sight of public eye. Because if these people truly don't care about art and about the art anymore, what's far more likely going to happen is that you are still not going to be able to get this form of art to grow. People no longer resonate with the inherent meaning behind the art, so no one actually continues to engage with that form of art. So the only source of funding these artists have now is your government funding, and you are throwing money into a bottomless abyss where you have no possible chance of gaining financial return. But finally, why is this particularly important? What is the obligation and function of state funding in the arts? We told you from the start of PM that it is to gain a return for funding into art. Because the government is a multifaceted form of spending, and you have finite amounts of resources to allocate to plenty of different causes. You could have sent this funding to things like welfare. You could have sent this funding to things like healthcare. You're inherently taking away a lot of inherent benefits that people could have gotten if you had not spent this funding into art. But you chose to put it into art. And that means you have a fundamental obligation to give some form of results, some form of return as the government, to be able to say that this helps to fulfill, to socially develop your community and socially develop your society. That means return is of utmost importance here. The entirety of PM that got completely ignored for profit was just completely unengaged with from the LO. Before I move on towards the rest of the substantive I'll take up POI.
So that entire harm just doesn't make sense. If you want welfare, then don't give out vouchers. So you're putting the same amount of money into vouchers. You're not giving welfare.
You're misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm saying we could have donated it to welfare, but we put it into art. Both sides are putting this funding into art. So you are still going to be funding art regardless, right? But what I'm saying is that if you're putting funding into art, you better make sure you have returns for it. So there's no possible excuse for you to say, oh, I spent like hundreds of thousands of dollars, went into art and lost all the money along the way. That's just complete bull. You cannot run away from this burden in the round. What exactly is the comparative here? I actually gave you a brilliant argument about the empowerment of oppositional and critical art. We also tell you how we clash with this idea of accessibility in art as well in this further engagement. The problem at the current moment with art is conventional art currently caters to the rich, because right now art is inaccessible to the poor and working class, because the ability to opt into art via high museum prices often pushes people out, and the amount of time they have to push to engage with this art is quite limited. This happens under their status quo of their conventional funding, where governments are now forced to fund art that is, catering to the rich that are most likely to engage with the art. What we do is we give people the power to engage with this art. we no longer have to worry about the cost of this art because these people are subsidized by the state. And that means more poor and more working class individuals contribute to art, more art contributes towards them, and that means more individuals are able to grow art as a result.
Wonderful. Thank you, DPM. DLO.
Hello, POI's through voice. Sorry, I'll put this closer. Sorry, I'll put my timer up. I didn't prepare well. Okay.
No worries.
Okay. Starting my speech. In 3, 2, 1. We cannot rely on the benevolence of the majority when vulnerable actors rely on the state to fund a lot of the things that the majority does not want. And therefore, it is much more important for us to value a lot of these art that is central to the culture and identities of different people. They explain on their side of the house as to why we need voucher funds and we should have returns and the right investment. But they don't necessarily explain what exactly is the right place to do this. They just simply asserted that just because a lot of people like it, that means we have to put in our more funding. I'm going to prove with 3 responses as to why we don't necessarily need voucher funding, and the demand for art that is already loved by the community, by the majority, will still exist on either side of the house. Firstly, in places like France and Germany, leisure and the want to spend money, regardless if vouchers exist, already exist. So therefore, people always go towards museums, plays, or even other forms of like art that they enjoy as their free time, given the fact that they have a cultural a relationship towards this. But second, a lot of the time, tourists already funds those types of art that we don't necessarily need to give people vouchers in order for them to access and to gain a lot of money for places like museums or even libraries that collects a lot of these types of art in the first place. So therefore, this doesn't necessarily prove it. The last point is that the poor probably on both sides of the house don't want to use this voucher for things like art, given the fact that they're probably more in line towards things like making sure that they have a job or making sure that they work extra hours instead of going towards a museum or whatnot, or simply resting their time instead of like going out into like public museums. What does this 3 responses proves? It proves that there's no necessity or urgency on their side of the house because a lot of these art is likely going to exist either way, and therefore they're just simply throwing money towards places that already has sufficient funding. The nuance of direct funding is much more broader than just simply funding specific art. It means things like funding education, so that the ability for people to continue a lot of the art forms that they have that is embedded towards the culture, even in niche communities. Second, it also means towards things like preservation within museums. Instead of giving a lot of these funding towards the demand side, we give a lot of the funding towards the supply side that ensures a lot of preservation. Thirdly, it also means that the nuance of direct funding means that the upliftment of traditional art, so that we recreate a lot of the interest and peak that public demand on our side of the house. The second response I want to say towards their prime minister was they say that governments don't have epistemic access and therefore makes them bad representative. That's just true and uncomparative for 3 specific reasons. Firstly, populist-based demands such as voucher are unrepresentative of the art that exists within diverse sets of culture. So therefore, this is just reflective of the majoritarian culture on their side of the house, which is the thing that they wanted to defend. Second, there's a lot of mechanisms for governments to allocate artistic funding that is separate from government politicians. Places like commissions, art centers, or even NGOs that get a lot of this direct funding to begin with. This proves 2 things. That firstly, they succumb to play things like the tyranny of the majority, with a much more worse off comparative. Or 2, it just simply means that there's a dominant form of like the private industry collecting and dominant a lot of these art spaces. The third thing I want to respond to is that they explain that government funds a lot of bad art, given the fact they have bad incentives like being homophobic or racist. Understand that a lot of these things are also symmetric. The majority can also be homophobic and racist towards certain individuals, and therefore they're likely going to push a lot of art, therefore, to be something that is bad. So it's untrue and unassertive. But the second thing is that experts also who study art and how to cultivate art are things that allows us to fund direct funding towards these types of individuals. The harm on their end is that they think that art demanded by the majority will always be good. This assumption is just inherently unproven. Versus on our side of the house, direct funding often creates a lot of interest and peak that public demand. We posit that it encourages a lot of exploration towards niche art. That's the reason as to why film festival gets inspired by non-majority culture that's directly funded by the government. Malaysia also translate a lot of their literature from ethnic languages so that they have the ability to access it. Even in France, has provinces that they allow paintings to be part of certain museums, even though these things are not heavily demanded, but creates a lot of demand in the future because we supply it. Before moving on, sure.
Politics has traditionally been the arena of the rich and the privileged. Why would these people care more about minorities than, minorities?
So that's the thing. Minority art is funded by the government because that's their own obligation, versus on your side of the house, they will only fund by the demand side, such as elitist art. So that's the thing, that's the difference between this debate. Efficiency on their side of the house is not the standard of this debate and not the standard in which how we fund art. Yes, we want to protect indigenous art on our side of the house, even without that demand, or cultural art, even if there's lack of demand, given the fact that these are important towards individual people that are part of the minority, that they will trade off on their sand. To extension then, firstly, why artists suffer from this replacement of funding given the fact that it's institutional based? 4 mechanisms. Firstly, institutional funding also fund things like cultural art centers, National Heritage Commission, and art-focused NGOs, which they cut off on their side of the house that PM conceded to. Second, there's a lack of support for upcoming artists that go towards national competitions and regional competitions to ensure that we have a lot of revitalization of certain art forms that might be new but have lack of demand, given the fact that there are new art forms. 3, public guarantees that scout a lot of artists have now less resources on their side of the house and therefore creates bad supply and bad art on their end, given the fact that it's only majoritarian culture that dictates a lot of this art. Fourthly, it also means that we have less funding in the art academe. People who want to study preservation, historical art, and even technical skills of arts that is likely going to lose out on their end. What is the impacts of this? Twofold. Firstly, robust institutions that protect, reward, and research the art and culture become significantly much more weaker on their end, given the fact they replace the entire fund in and of itself. But second, it also means that we legitimizes as we state that art is less important and that the youth and the individuals that are new towards this field should not go towards these fields. But thirdly, it also means that artists of the day have less resources in order for them to prop up a lot of their careers. What is the comparative of this debate? Understand that on our side of the house, direct funding is much more malleable and targeted versus voucher funds that have only benefit the individual people's desire to access art and is not as malleable given the fact these are cultural, embeddedly, or like majoritarian perspectives. That means on our side of the house, dealing with the same amount of funds, that means the portion of that institutional fund disappears. Second extension then, while the state has incentive to preserve niche art that does not have a lot of demand but important to the identity and livelihoods of small community, I'm going to contextualize this debate. Most often than not, culturally diverse countries are subjected to the whims of the majority, and therefore there's a demand of culture of their own, and therefore direct funding allows us to do this in the first place. Funding a lot of these types of culture revitalizes that culture. Places like the Mayan heartland in central Mexico. The Philippines fund a lot of Ifugao art directly. The New Zealand provide funding for the preservation of indigenous art. These are things that often requires funding that the majority don't necessarily see. The impacts of this is threefold. Firstly, vouchers does not directly benefit a lot of these communities that often rely on the funding of the government or subsidies by the government so that they can continue their practices and art and therefore export a lot of these art towards urban places so that people can get to appreciate it and even people get to study a lot of these cultural art to begin with. But second, it also means that vouchers are not concerned with the sustainability of a lot of the art. Personal choice is very short term, which is the thing that they want to defend on their end. And therefore, we often are succumb to things like fads or entertainment cycles that don't necessarily think about the sustainability of the longevity of that specific art culture. In conclusion, these are things that we don't necessarily want to trade off. And it's okay that we don't fund majoritarian art, given the fact that they already have enough spotlight. Thanks.
Thank you, DLO. Kavit.
Hello, everyone. Could I please check if I'm audible?
All good, yes. Visible to Ian, if that helps.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Never mind, I was just kidding. Go ahead.
Just PY me in the chat, please. If I perform an opera in the middle of a forest and no one hears it, did I even make a sound? The reality is, opposition bench's conception of preserving minority art is to throw money at it and hope that more people go towards it, without considering whether governments would A, have an incentive to do this, B, whether they'd be able to pick the right minority art, or C, whether this is even a worthwhile use of government funds. Government will take this debate in three fronts. The first is to explain why, on terms of, and just I explain where governments spend money in the status quo. Ashley gives you a lot of analysis that's actually unrebutted. She points out that number one, governments tend to be made out of privileged elites. If it is the case that your governments if it is the case that your electorate are all members of the majority or mostly members of the majority, then we are sort of screwed on either side. But Ashley uniquely explains that people who end up in politics tend to be those who are disproportionately privileged, disproportionately high income, disproportionately well educated. These are individuals who are even more there's greater layers of separation between themselves and minorities as compared to the general public, because these are the people who are disproportionately privileged. The second thing she points out is that education in art produces a prioritization of intellectually stimulating art. People who have art degrees tend to love Shakespeare and Marlowe rather than things that are more common to the daily person. But see, there's echo chambers that are formed here, right? When you are a government bureaucracy, you tend to self-reinforce and suck up to the Minister of Culture. If the Minister of Culture is an old Malay man or an old Indian man, unfortunately, you're going to have to suck up to that old Indian man to endless extents. This means that his conception of what good art is all going to be the conception of the bureaucracy as well. Opposition tells us that we want to be able to fund minority art, and we have to shovel the money towards a minority, with doing little to no analytical legwork to explain why that is the most likely way that governments fund money. Given Ashley's analysis, it is more likely that that money will be funneled towards art that appeals to the majority, appeals to old Malay, old Indian men. All of this therefore means that the odds of you getting a proper piece of minority art are slim to none on that side as well. Secondly, we point out that in a lot of instances, the public themselves are perfectly willing to fund minority art comparatively, either because it is interesting and intellectually interesting to them. So Black Lives Matter, for example, is a ground up movement. You didn't see the government funding Black Lives Matter. It was the people themselves who organized the movement. But secondly, you have situations where individuals themselves want minority art. And that makes me to my second question. How do we protect minority art as well? The first thing to point out is that we have a very straightforward actor who will fund minority art: minorities. If it is the case that governments have a strong political will to fund minority art and help minorities, they will give them more vouchers to minorities proportionally, as Ashley points out. How do we flip this issue? Within minority art, there are multiple conceptions of what good art looks like. You can have 5 painters who are painting minority art and who are competing with each other to determine what good minority art is like. You can have 20 SAP players, 20 traditional Filipino artists, all of whom are competing in the same sphere. Which gets government funding is arbitrary and dependent on how you can appeal to an old Filipino man as compared to on our side, where if we give money to the minorities themselves, they can pick and choose which one of these 5 artists are the most appealing to them. Because if it is the case that minorities truly want to preserve their art, they have more information about what art constitutes good minority art on our side. In their world, they rely on bureaucrats to decide. They rely on bureaucrats who have no idea what minority art is good minority art, because governments tend to be dominated by racial majorities. All of this then means that the odds of them picking the right minority art to fund is slim to none. We pick the correct ones that need to be funded as well. But even just intellectually interestingly, right? Like, it is also speculatively possible that more liberal people want to consume minority art. They get sick and tired of art that's false to the majority. There's only so many Marvel movies you can watch before you get bored of it. If there is truly a demand for preserving culture, then individuals will move there as well. But beyond that, even if we're talking about the inherent value of minority art, for example, education, like museums fall under departments of education usually. Like, if you want to talk about educational funding, that is a separate pool of money. This is about funding artists to create new art rather than serving historically important pieces of art. I think they just get the debate wrong on that front. What is the end of this clash? The end of this clash is that the main push coming from opposition is just mistaken. There is no mechanization, and if Octwhip comes up with it, well, it's fucking late lah. Like, there's no mechanization why that is the likely form of art they'll fund. We have given you a clear picture of how art is likely to be given, funding is likely to be given to minorities on our side, and we flip this further by pointing out that art is given to the correct minority artists on our side as compared to minority artists who might just not be very good, but are very, very good at appealing to bureaucrats, who can think and speak and appeal to bureaucrats in the majority language the best, often not necessarily the best minority artists. Sure.
That's just completely untrue that individual people can have the ability to scout indigenous artists, because that's an assertion, versus commissions that they can actively look for indigenous art and put them up to galleries for easier access for people. No one will go to the mountains to look for indigenous art. So
the people in the mountains will go to the mountains to look for indigenous art, because the people in the mountains also get vouchers, right? And if you're talking about a government commission, primarily comprising of educated, privileged majorities, and even if you have a couple of minorities there, they're probably the most privileged minorities out there, I'd actually trust the fellas in the mountains to pick the right artists, because they're the ones who appeal to the people in the mountains the best. Second question then, on how governments should fund art that people care about. Let's wipe the slate clean from the rest of my speech and assume that they get perfect funding for minority arts. crucially, the trade-off that they haven't taken yet is that this is clearly minority art that people don't want to go to, because the comparative and where the debate actually occurs in are the areas where this art would have comparatively died out. These are the poorest of the worst of the minority artists, or if we have no funding for minority arts, that's fine. Clearly, minorities themselves don't want to give money to that art as well. There are 3 reasons why you ought not to prioritize this art. Number 1, people won't consume it, right? That governments are just spending money in an economically inefficient way. Gelson points out that on our side, money could have gone towards welfare on the principal level, and it might even still go to welfare, because if people don't cash in the check, the government doesn't get charged for the check, and the government has more money left over at the end of the month, which it can then spend on welfare in the next month. On our side of the house, we help minorities as well, except we help them put food on the table rather than artificially propping up art projects that no one ends up going to. You have an empty gallery with a lot of seats and nice air conditioning, but no fellas going there to look at the art on their side, because clearly it is unpopular art. If it were popular, we would have funded it on our side through the voucher system. That's why they can't get through to their heads. But the last thing I want to note is that art in and of itself is meant to produce joy. Note, at the end of every argument they made about culture, the end impact is people feel pride in it. People feel happiness from it. If people are not funding it on that side, people don't feel pride in it. People don't feel happiness from it. Why not then shift that money towards art that people do feel pride in, that people do feel happiness about? That might look like culture. It might look like art that is just popular and majoritarian and fat, trendy. But if that brings you joy at the end of a hard day of work, if it makes you happy, if it gives you the only thing in society we can consider important, that's a far better use of money than funding empty galleries no one will go to. Propose.
Thank you, Gabi. Upwith.
Hi, am I audible? Like this, hopefully I'm audible.
Yes, very much so. We can hear you.
Sorry, is that about me, the water bottle?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
yes. Was
yeah,
that not
I'm
a
sorry.
I was
Okay.
typing, that's why I got delayed in like unmuting myself. Anyway.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead with this speech whenever you're ready.
Yeah. When art dies, the blood, sweat, and tears of the decades of experiences and souls that inspire the art also die. You cannot let art die like what government wants. One big discussion with a bunch of subgroups, where do we get more diverse art and why is this so important? Because government tells you, just get rid of art nobody appreciates. We don't care about it. First response, understand it's extremely ignorant to assume that nobody appreciates some kind of art out there. Insofar, somebody will always appreciate it. Just because government team doesn't appreciate it doesn't mean everybody hates it as well. There is always going to be somebody that understands that this art is important. For once, the creator, the people, the indigenous tribes who create this art, or the intended audience for this art, even if you make something so niche and so obscure that you cannot appreciate it as the majoritarian population, doesn't necessarily mean that there are smaller groups who don't appreciate it. It's often these art that dies out. What is the conclusion to this? The conclusion is really simple. Government significantly limits the choices people have for art, insofar as they only limit it to what people want to fund, and that's not necessarily good because funding only works when majoritarian of the people opt into this art. The world is significantly worse than government because if we rely on the public to choose what art they want to fund, it's likely going to be extremely mainstream art, like what Gabi tells you, things that are trendy or things that are necessarily always not very meaningful to them, but actually have a lot of meaning to a subgroup. They try to say, oh, then let the people who enjoy that art in that subgroup fund that art. But understand, this response doesn't necessarily work because your vouchers are often spread thin and not enough for you to pay for that sort of art to continue to be alive and to allow the industry to be propped up within its minority and within its niche. It's likely that you only have a few people paying for this art and it's not enough in their vouchers and they're unwilling to actually or unable to pay out of their pocket for the creation of art, insofar as the creation of art is significantly more important than the consumption of art. The creation of one single art piece might take hundreds and thousands of dollars and even millions of dollars for you to only pay $10 to go into a museum. And this is significantly why government side is unable to prop up a lot of the art on their side because people do not necessarily want to be able to fund a lot of these things that are important to them, and they're unable to fund it within their vouchers. But government tries to skirt this and say they can still protect art that they find valuable. I understand that this is not just something that they can fiat. They have to explain why you have enough money to do both vouchers insofar as they say they put all their money into vouchers. But secondly, this is unproven insofar as when art protection is extremely expensive, you cannot just have your art voucher spread thin because, like I said, it's unable to do anything. So either on government side, it's done extremely badly and this form of art is still going to die, or secondly, they have to be really, really selective of the art that they try to preserve, which is significantly worse when you let the public decide what it is, because there are so much more valuable art that is not listened to, that people are not exposed to in the first place. This is why it's important when Kim tells you a lot of indigenous art was only able to survive because there's significantly a lot funding, they boost its visibility, and people finally see the value within it. It's not that people never liked the art, it's that people never knew it existed in the first place. And if it never existed in the first place on government side, a lot of things die out. Government there try to argue then state heads are bad at choosing what art to keep because they're bureaucratic, because they're mean, they're horrible. It's untrue insofar as it's not the government officials themselves trying to choose what art they want to be able to preserve when they have things like departments of culture and art and the NCAA, where oftentimes they are the people who appreciate all forms of art and know what type of art is important to preserve. So it's likely to be either art critics or representative people from laymen or from local indigenous people trying to fight for wider art is important, or even professionals who have studied art for millions and for like years and years, and it's literally their specialization, which is why they're probably going to choose art that most people can appreciate. This is why when you go to the National Museum in Taiwan or in the Philippines, you're not going to see things like just a canvas with a line of painting on it. You're going to see a lot of beautiful, robust art because it's what people honestly value from these art critics and art departments. This is why the only times you see art that people don't appreciate and empty art galleries is on government side, because they rely on private funded galleries where more private individuals and rich individuals are the ones who are more likely to have bad taste in art because they're likely to choose things that are abstract and not understandable. It's the private galleries on government side that stay empty, and on opposition side, it's the public national museums that are filled with art that are understood and robust. The conclusion is extremely simple. You are assertive on government side that we choose bad art, which is ignorant and wrong, and I think fairly classist. But secondly, because they don't respond to Gabi, who tells you without direct funding, you rely on private funding, which makes art significantly worse in less diversity and more expensive. I'll take a POI.
So in order for governments to outsource the majority of their funding towards like third party, which is highly unlikely given how governments are usually defensive, they would first have to admit fault in themselves, which governments are notoriously unwilling to do, as Ashley points out. This means that in their hubris, they're likely to try to pick art which appeals to them, which tends to be extremely.
This is where I say that's bullshit. Because first of all, governments can invest in new art that is just as important. This is why in the Louvre in France, they cycle through art monthly or even yearly. So I think it's bullshit that they stick with one bad art for the entire time for the 10 years that the Louvre will exist. So that's just pure bullshit. But secondly, I think they're able to understand that they want to be able to preserve a lot of art that is just as meaningful to the government, because they have, even if they are bad, they have agendas they want to push, that their government is strong, that their government is smart, that they're full and rich in history. So even if both sides of this house has bad art, then at least we have more art to cater to more people, and we don't rely on the majority. Listen and vibe check government side. They say fuck all art when we tell you a lot of the things are important to us. If it's about money being well spent on government side, then I think the survival of the history of the victims of genocide, or the livelihoods of local artists, and the way they teach new generations how to love their country with patriotism and nationalism through this art is just as important. And it's not just money ROI and cash ROI that is important. It's a lot of these culture building and a lot of these things where they fund indigenous tribes, or where they are able to preserve a lot of things like cities that rely on the tourism of these different things. ROI is not always about money. So I think it's bullshit that government tries to tell you they want to earn money because they're already losing money on art in the first place by funding public parks. If I water the grass in a public park, no one's going to pay me for watering the fucking grass. The point is, opposition has a significantly more urgent problem, and I think that you should opt into opposition. Thank you.
Thank you. Op reply.
Hello. I'm gonna Can I give my, can I borrow timer?
Oh yeah, you can.
Oh, okay. Okay. 3, 2. Three, two. Art is the antithesis to the rigid utilitarianism that government is so vehemently fighting for. I think it's just disingenuous for government to consistently claim that when a state funds art, they do it just because they want immediate returns or ROIs. DPM accuses me or accuses us of glamorizing and over romanticizing art. But that's true because that's what art is. Art is romantic. Art is glamorous and beautiful. Art is meant to distract you from this absurd world. And art is supposed to tell the stories of people who have no other methods to tell it themselves. Government aims to make the specific art that is being propagated boring and absurd. Opposition has two win conditions to provide a path to a clear victory. Firstly, we have to answer the question, is it in the interest of the state? What is their interest to non-majoritarian art? Because we have to ask and vibe check ourselves, which we, especially my whip, has been doing throughout her entire speech, which is to ask, is government painting a real and pressing urgency? Panel, they are not. Understand that firstly, the context that my partner and deputy provided, with the fact that majoritarian art is majoritarian for a reason and is already presently funded and popular. So funding and investing in other types of minority arts and indigenous art, for example, won't take away from the popularity, the tickets that goes to popular museums, the tickets that goes to important plays and other forms of artistic activities. But secondly, government whip can't just dismiss my partner's extensions on the direct investment to things like other institutions and educational materials. Because understand that by its very nature, direct investment already translates to different aspects of how governments perceive and try to deal with art. They can't just pick and choose the specific type of investments that happens because, since the majority of opposition's constructive speakers have already told you the fact that that's what governments already do right now. Governments subsidize art education. They subsidize tourism for these specific art projects. They subsidize indigenous communities to continuously create specific fashion styles, specific sculptures, and other aspects of their art. Kim, timer. I don't know where it is. It's gone. So, which means that these specific investments are already in that nature. But also, understand that the vast majority of my deputy's materials and my materials as well was largely unresponded to. Because in order to vibe check the urgency and to tell why the urgency isn't actually real in government side, we need to ask the question, do we really need the policy of vouchers in the first place? No, we do not. Just look at government's inconsistencies. In the first and second speaker, they try to tell us that art, it's okay for minority and niche parts of art like indigenous art to die because people don't care about them because there are no returns. But then Whip comes in to tell that, Gov can still protect these specific types of art. The mountains can buy the vouchers or whatever. They don't even have a clear goal because their first two speakers are going against their third speakers. But secondly, understand that is it really necessary? Because they try to push the need for returns, for ROIs. It isn't worth investing in if people don't get anything out of it. What returns? Or when I go to a museum, am I gonna become my 200% better in the job I do? When I join the museum, am I gonna become a super soldier or something? No, because the specific type of returns is contingent on how individuals perceive the arts that are meant for them. And this is why it is so abhorrent that government wants to trade off and let indigenous and more niche forms of art die. Because just because they aren't in the majority does not mean nobody cares about them. It just means that people aren't aware of their existence, but they still hold an important meaning to individuals who see this as part of their legacy, who see this as something that their ancestors passed down to them from generations of suffering. Understand that the returns on our side of the house is the individual catharsis and happiness that people from all parts of life, from all parts of the country, can gain from the art being presented. When you compare this in government, the people and types of art who are pushing down in people's throat is elitist, controlled by the 1%, and is most likely to not be effective in that individual catharsis we value so much. Thank you, Proto Oppose.
Thank you. Off reply. Cover reply.
The fundamental strategic flaw in the op is they never mechanize to you how they plan on generating traction among the people. All 4 speeches from op have been grocery lists on different types of art we could fund, but very little goes into explaining the path for organic growth for that kind of art. We were charitable enough to take the trade-off on what kind of art we should defend. Op wanted to defend funding every type of art on earth and somehow still managed to sound feasible. Op, money where? As long as you don't answer that question, you cannot win the round. The first strategic flaw in the op is they don't seem to understand how government spending should be weighed. This debate is about the role of government funds and what obligation the state holds itself to in the determination of where it puts its money. What are the obligations of the state? We told you to no engagement. It is A, gain a return for funding into art, because the spending of resources into art indicates a trade-off of funding taken away from other venues of spending like welfare. So you then have to justify this trade-off for spending by getting as much return as possible. So it doesn't matter what bullshit context DLO or Opwit gives to you for why popular art is already being privately funded. We want to fund already popular art to double our earnings and justify our spendings to the max. But secondly, we want to empower consumers to consume art because it contributes to the freedom of expression amongst the people. It in turn generates income for artists that also want to put out artworks for themselves, thus playing into their own metric of production of art. It is not to ensure the success of every type of art. The reason for this is simple. There are millions of different types of art and you can't protect all of them. Guys, we're both spending the same amount of budget on art. Opwit agrees that art production is expensive, which is why it is mathematically impossible for Op to fund all the types of art, but we only can fund some. If we're talking about the most niche types of art, then your government still has to trade off certain types of niche art to which you gave us no standard for how you determine what good art is or better art is or not. Just because one fella likes to make art by throwing fish balls at a wall or something doesn't mean government has an immediate obligation to fund his fish balls, because the benefit of this one person comes at the cost of hundreds of others who could have used this funding in welfare. But I'm going to be very charitable here and explain why they can't even win on their own metric. We told you from the very start of PM that the government is often full of rich and privileged people anyway, so that's why governments are often terrible actors who decide what good art is. No engagement to this. If they wanted to save minority art, we say the best people to do it are the minorities. We're more than down to give them more vouchers. We're more than down to give them more power to revive their forms of art. I don't know why this ability to revive minority art is exclusive on their side. How do we determine the obligations? How do we fulfill the obligations of the state better? A, gaining returns. Op completely ignores this clash point and just says doesn't matter. It's fatal because insofar as they don't prove the ability for them to fund art organically grow over time, that means that art will die anyways until you continue funding for all of perpetuity. So if the next government comes in and goes like, oh, I want to fund this different type of art, then your current type of funding for art is going to die out because they got no other form of revenue other than government spending. We told you we have far more proportionate allocation of spending on different types of art because of the fundamental difference in our models. Where Op is required to make guesses and to act first, we are able to be on par with actions in the market. We don't spend unless people are engaging with the art. We don't need to waste money unless people are using the vouchers. The impact is massive because over an infinite amount of time, the hundreds of dollars you waste that accumulate to trillions, like quadrillions of dollars, are dollars you will never get back. So the role of the government is better carried out where we can save this wasted money and allocate it to better forms of art or better areas of spending. But secondly, the empowerment of consumers in the art to grow the industry. I want to note not a single response has been given to our art on democratization of art. We told you why catering to the rich exists more on your side because they're the ones that control politicians and the ones that control the government on your side under conventional art, where you get to unilaterally decide what funding of art is good or not. When we gave power to the people, we allowed people to start determining through their purchasing power what kinds of art is good to consume. That means more accessibility on the intellectualism behind the art. That means more ideas and more subjects that they can resonate with via people of the working class. What this means is on our side, we not only make far more accessible art, far better art, but at the same time far cheaper art. Opposition's case is full of poetry, but that's all there is to it. And just like the types of art that no one cares about, we believe it should just die out.
Wonderful. Thank you for reply. Thank you everyone for this lovely round. I will be back for the OA shortly. Please stay in this room. I'm just going to disconnect from audio, so feel free to chat amongst yourselves, make merry, whatever.